picking up where we left off, we are now going to be discussing active transport. So, again, transporting material across the cell membrane is necessary to maintain homeostasis. We talked about passive transport already. Passive transport does not require any energy, and it goes down the concentration gradient. So, passive transport moves materials from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. That happens naturally, so it does not require energy. However, we are now going to talk about active transport. Active transport is the exact opposite of passive transport. So it's going to move substances against the concentration gradient. And that means that we are going to move substances from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. And this is kind of like pumping water uphill. Like you totally can do it, but it requires energy. Now, the energy of a cell is called ATP, much like the energy in your house is called electricity. The energy in your car is called gasoline. The energy for a cell is just called ATP. It's a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, but that's kind of a mouthful, so we call it ATP. Active transport is going to help us move material from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. And there are two types of active transport. Molecular transport, the name suggests you're moving a couple of molecules at a time. And then there is bulk transport. And bulk transport, like the name suggests, is going to be moving a bunch of stuff at a time. All right, so let's start by talking about molecular transport. So, molecular transport is the type of active transport used to carry small molecules and or ions across the cell membrane. They are carried out by transport proteins called protein pumps. So here's our friends, the proteins again. So when we talked about macromolecules, we said proteins have like a bazillion jobs. This is one of the jobs that proteins do. They help move molecules across the cell membrane against the concentration gradient in something called a protein pump. Um, so again, they use energy from the cell, they use ATP to move materials across the cell membrane against the concentration gradient. Again, molecular transport is a form of active transport. So, one of the more, I guess, popular, well known, I'm not sure how to phrase this, forms of a protein pump is a sodium potassium pump. This is one of those times where science actually names something where it makes sense because a sodium potassium pump moves sodium and potassium. Like you don't have to guess at what it's doing. The sodium potassium pump is a very, very powerful transport protein. What it does is it moves ions. Ions are, if you recall from we talked about chemistry earlier in the year, they are these little tiny charged particles. So, why are they so important? They're so important because they help our nerves pass electrical signals, which is kind of the entire purpose of our nervous system is to send signals. So, we talked earlier when we started talking cell theory about prokaryotes and eukaryotes and how multicellular eukaryotic organisms like us humans, we have specialized cells. Well, we've talked about how specialized cells have different organelles depending on what their function is. So we talked about how muscle cells need a lot of energy, so they have a lot of mitochondria. We've talked about how liver cells are used to detoxify the body, so they have a lot of smooth ER inside of the cells. Well, nerve cells, their whole function is to pass electrical signals. Nerve cells have a ton of these sodium potassium pumps in their cell membranes because again, the entire function of your nervous system is to pass electrical signals. So that way you can, pretty much do anything in your body. All right, so like I said, we are going to skip the video. If you are really interested in watching the Amoeba Sister video, I will make the link available, but I do want to finish up the notes on time and then still have time to do the Kahoot because our quiz is scheduled for tomorrow. All right, so bulk transport. Bulk transport is the other form of active transport. Bulk transport doesn't just move one or two molecules, one or two ions at a time. Bulk transport literally is going to carry a large clump of material across the cell membrane. And it usually involves changing the shape of the cell membrane. Um, and basically, what we end up doing is we end up forming a vacuole. Remember, the organelle, the vacuole is like literally just a storage container inside the cell. And that vacuole, and then of course we use vesicles, and vesicles are just vacuoles that move. Um, so we form a vacuole to transport large amounts of material either into or out of the cell. Again, this requires energy, so bulk transport, it doesn't matter if you're going in or out, bulk transport is active. It's an active form of transport, so it requires energy and it goes against the concentration gradient, just so that you are aware of that. So there are two main types of bulk transport. There is exocytosis. Exocytosis is when materials exit the cell. As you can see in the diagram, we have this vacuole, usually containing some sort of waste material. It will move to the cell wall, it will fuse with the cell membrane, and then it literally opens up and it releases whatever's inside out into the extracellular space. This is primarily used to do excretion from the cell. So this is basically your little tiny individual cells going to the bathroom, if you want to think of it that way. Okay? Like this is getting rid of the waste. So it's just like you go to the bathroom and you get rid of your waste product, and there's a system to do that in your body. Each individual cell has a system, namely exocytosis, for getting rid of their waste products. Total side note, if we couldn't do this, if our cells could not have exocytosis, that waste product would build up in the cell and you would have cellular death. So that's never a good thing. All right, so exocytosis, exiting the cell. The opposite of endocytosis is endocytosis. Again, endocytosis is still a form of active transport. It still requires energy. It still goes against the concentration gradient. But in endocytosis, excuse me, we have materials entering the cell. So it's kind of the opposite. The cell membrane sees something it likes on the outside, it sort of gobbles it up, and then it pulls it in when it forms that vacuole or vesicle. There are three types of endocytosis: phagocytosis, pinocytosis, and the big giant mouthful, receptor mediated endocytosis. But again, endocytosis, as a general rule, is just materials entering the cells. Guys, again, if you're trying to message me, you're going to have to, what's it called? You're going to have to unmute yourself and speak because I cannot see the chat when I'm in screen share mode. All right, so these are just some pictures of endocytosis. We'll talk about these each individually, not a big deal. All right, phagocytosis is literally cells eating. So if there is a food particle near the cell membrane, it is going to create a little vesicle. It will see the food particle. It'll change the shape of the cell membrane into like almost a pseudopod, and it will swallow in that food particle in a vacuole. So phagocytosis is endocytosis involving food. Basically, like I said, it's how your cells eat. Okay? Um Your white blood cells in your immune system, obviously in your blood, they do this to number one, eat damaged cells. And also, white blood cells do this to eat foreign particles in your bloodstream. Not to be disgusting, but if you've ever cut yourself and then you've had your cut get infected, and then maybe it gets a little swollen, and then you squeeze it a little bit, and then the pus comes out. I'm not trying to be gross, but what that pus is a bunch of white blood cells that have swallowed up bacteria that tried to get into your body. And then because it's so engorged, because it ate too much, kind of like when you eat too much Thanksgiving dinner, your belly gets full. When your white blood cells eat too many bacteria, they swell up. So yeah, phagocytosis results in that infected pus in cuts, and then of course, like, you clean it out and you keep the wounds clean and things like that, so it eventually heals. But when you see that, that is a your body's form of trying to protect you. So again, it's kind of gross, but it is a body's natural response, and it is a form of phagocytosis that we're usually all pretty familiar with. Pinocytosis is a cell drinking. So it's exactly like phagocytosis, but instead of taking in solid materials, it takes in liquids. So same exact function, right? Like, the cell membrane shape changes if there's a liquid nearby that that cell needs. It pinches off, and then it pulls that liquid in. So that's pinocytosis. Again, it is endocytosis. It's bringing materials into the cell. It is active transport. We're going against the concentration gradient. And lastly, of course, because it's active transport, it requires energy. The last one that I want to talk about here is going to be our receptor mediated endocytosis. I often say that receptor mediated endocytosis is like having a picky eater. Specialized receptor proteins on the surface of the membrane are looking for very specific things to consume. Once it finds them, they connect, then they create the vacuole, and then they pull it in. Um, This is, again, this is kind of like being a picky eater. Total side note for anybody considering a career in medicine in the future. This is also this whole receptor mediated endocytosis. This is how the HIV virus actually takes advantage of your cells, of your white blood cells specifically. Um, it mimics these ligands that will normally connect to the receptors. And your cell thinks that the HIV virus is actually nutrition that it needs. So it allows that virus to hook onto the T cell instead of having the white blood cell destroy it, which is kind of, ingenious, really, if you think about it. It's almost like virus camouflage, like the way that an animal or a chameleon might camouflage themselves in the wild to keep from getting eaten. The HIV virus will camouflage itself on these receptors, and it makes itself look like it's nutrition when indeed it's actually making people very, very sick. Anyways, something kind of fascinating about biology. So that is the end of your notes. The last page on your note catcher is questions about the notes, which you can get to as time permits.